Hello everyone, this is going to be the video for Chapter 4 PowerPoint. I want to go ahead and apologize beforehand because I will probably cough through some of this video because I'm still sick and I apologize for that. But I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as possible and not bog down too much. For instance, I'm not going to go through the first 18 slides because it's pretty straightforward, and especially if you think about it with common sense, it talks about a little bit more in chapter 3 had set up, the creation of the colonies, in particular New England, middle, and southern colonies. Well, this chapter in the beginning goes in a little bit more in depth. So, if you just keep in mind that, for instance, you live in Arkansas, if you really think about it, do you think that you live like the people who live in California? Or do you think your life is like that of someone who lives in New York City? Probably not, because there are many different ways of living, and it usually depends on where you live. And the climate plays a big impact in that as well. So that usually dictates, how you dress, what you eat, what kind of crops you can grow, and so on and so forth. So if you just keep that in mind when you're reading through the development of these different areas, it's pretty straightforward. Now, when you get down to this, I think it's slide 18 is where we're really going to pick up with this video, because these differences in lifestyles start to develop and it leads to a rising middle class. Now, before the 1700s, a middle class really didn't exist. You had those who were wealthy, and then you had those who were poor, who were peasants. But in the 1700s in particular, the middle class really starts to pick up because you get a group of people who have not only money to buy the necessities, but also people have enough money to actually do extra with it. So that also gives them, instead of just always working, for money, they have free time too. So with this free time, you get new ideas coming out of it. And one of the ideas were enlightenment. Enlightenment took place mostly in Europe. We did have our own section of it going on in America, and that's called the American Enlightenment. But it was just these new ideas that were being created. And it's also called the Age of Reason. And it comes along behind and along with the scientific revolution too. They kind of go hand in hand because the use of science uses the use of reason. So enlightenment also started to use the use of science and reason to start to come up with new ideas about how society should be working and how it actually was working. So you just get these new changes, ideas that maybe people are actually humans, if you're considered free, are supposed to have certain rights that no one else can take away from you. And of course, those become life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You've heard that before. Later on, it's changed to life, liberty, and property, because property is a little bit easier to define than happiness. But these new ideas just start to come about, and then people started to think about, how should society work using these new ideas. And one thing that really started to be used, in particular, the idea was that if there are rulers or people who are controlling you that deny you these basic rights of life, liberty, and either happiness or property, then you should eventually be able to overthrow them and you should reject their authority. And that becomes very important when we talk about the American Revolution, because that's where those ideas really started to pick up. But with that being said, when people started to turn towards reason as explanation for things, they started to turn away from religion as explanation of things. So that caused a lot of problems within the whole world, but the colonies in particular. So you have a lot of these ministers who were now trying to, in some way, make a compromise between reason and religion. They weren't always able to do that, but they did try. So some of them, they started to incorporate Enlightenment ideas into church teachings. Other things, there was the rejection of authoritarianism, that there is any one person who should be able to tell you completely how to live your life. And that's either a monarchy, if it's a pope, a religious official, it doesn't matter. So people started to really reject that idea that there is any one person who should control everything. And they also started to come up with the idea that there should be a rational explanation for everything and not just a divine explanation. So you get kind of this rationalism versus religion going on. So the ideas were no government should be able to tell others what to do. Everyone should be able to think rationally, and things should be explained clearly. However, religion had played such a large part, there was still trying to be some kind of compromise. So you get a new type of religion coming out of it, or religious thinking, called deism. And what that is that they were still trying to say that God existed, but God, being the supreme perfect being that he is, he created the universe so perfectly that he no longer has to be present to make sure it's carried out. That instead humans have the ability to reason and should be able to develop accordingly because they can reason things. The I think, therefore I am mentality. And this is still used today. There's still some who believe in the Big Bang Theory, but also consider themselves deists because they believe that it was God who created the Big Bang, but then no longer had to be present because the universe just played out how it was supposed to be. But that's neither here or there. But that section of religion was created out of the Enlightenment ideas that were starting to be introduced in the 1700s. And some of the famous American Enlightenment, well, not American, but some of the famous Enlightenment thinkers were Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Paine. And they play a huge role when we start to talk about the American Revolution. But because of these new ideas coming about, there also had to be changes in pretty much other aspects of living. Education was one of them. Harvard College had already been built in the early 1600s, but it started to change over time from being just a place for ministers to go to learn, and they started to add other aspects of education to it. And one of them was, or an area that started to be included with some of these Enlightenment ideas. And then education started to spread throughout the colonies instead of just having these colleges for ministers. You had more and more schools being created, and especially for children to go to and start to learn as well. And then you had other changes like the change in press. Press is like newspapers and the way that information is dispersed within society. So before this time period, you really weren't supposed to write bad things about someone who is considered your better, the uppers of society. You weren't really supposed to write bad things about them. But in the 1700s, that idea started to change. And it really kicked off with, and your book talks about this, the John Peter Zenger trial in New York. So John Peter Zenger wrote an expose about the governor of New York. And pretty much most of the information was factual that he was putting forward in his newspaper. But because this was the governor, that was considered a no-no. You weren't supposed to talk bad about the governor. So he was arrested and put on trial. However, throughout this trial, it kept being brought up that this was not, he wasn't lying about the governor. He was saying factual things. So he actually wins that trial. He's acquitted because the information he had presented was factually correct. So this set a precedent, and a precedent is something, a first thing that can, sets the pace for the things to follow. And the precedent was that now you could actually have freedom of the press, where you could print things as long as they were factual about other people, in particular governors or even all the way up to the king, as long as it was factual. So it really pushed forward the idea of freedom of the press, which was one of those Enlightenment ideas, that you should be able to disperse information, especially if it's facts, to other people. And that your rank in society should no longer be able to shield you from that. So that pushed forward that and other ideas as well. And going back to that whole religion going along with Enlightenment, there was sort of a movement to try to get people back into the churches, because with Enlightenment, less and less people were attending church because they were now using rational thought and rational explanations of things. So they really didn't need, or according to them, divine explanations of life or anything. So there was a movement to push forward to get more people back to going to church. It was called the Great Awakening. And it really signified a change with how religious information was being presented. So you get more and more Enlightenment ideals being pushed through religion. And something that really was new was, except for, we talked about the Quakers, but this was new for the Protestants, that people should be equal in Christ. People should be equal in religious study. If you're going to church, you're not better in religion just because you're better in society, and so on and so forth. So these were new ideas that were being pushed forward. Not everybody was on board with them, though, so you get this, fight with how things used to be, with fighting against new ideas. So you get the old lights versus the new lights, and so on and so forth. But the overall ideas pushed forward by the Great Awakening was that there was a need for more churches. That was one, so you get the growth of churches. You also get new denominations. So before, we had talked about a little bit that, previously there was the Catholic Church, and then the Catholic Church splits, and when you get the Protestant Reformation, so now you have two different churches, like the Church of England and the Catholic Church. But then after the Great Awakening, you just start to get more and more of these denominations. Most of you today know that if you drive around, especially Jonesboro, but anywhere, you're going to see different types of churches. You're going to see First Baptist and Second Baptist and Methodist and so on and so forth. So many different denominations, all within the overall Christianity, but still, this all starts to rise because of the Great Awakening. And then, because you need more colleges to train these ministers, you get the growth of colleges, the development of new ones. Some that we know today as being our Ivy League colleges, they started out as colleges to train ministers, like Harvard was one of them, but it started to change. Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. They were all started out to train ministers, but then over time they became something else. But you get a more compromise between religion and science. You get decline of authority, though. Even though you get the growth of churches, you get decline of, in particular, religious authority. So the ministers who had before this time, especially when we talked about Massachusetts colony and stuff, the ministers being pretty much in control of society, they had less power. They were now just authority figures in church, but not really in people's everyday life, more just religious authorities. Two of the major names of the Great Awakening were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. You're going to get different people who go back and forth about which one was more influential. Either way, they were both involved, and they both kind of created revivalist movements and things like that. So there's that. Now here's where it gets a little interesting, because at the same time that you get this new ideas about freedom coming through from the Enlightenment and reason and all this other stuff, you also get the rise and the use of slavery. How that makes sense, I don't know. When you have on one hand people talking about, freedoms that are inherent to humanity, and then, hey, let's have slaves. It doesn't make sense, but it happened at this time. So the slave process, though, in chapter 3, we talked a little bit about slavery, but we didn't go into detail excuse me, about slavery itself within Africa. So, Europeans themselves, especially the English, who kind of really pushed forward the Atlantic slave trade, they were not the ones going into Africa to capture the people they wanted to use as slaves. Instead, they were using other Africans to do that for them. And Africans wanted horses and guns and valuables from Europeans, so they often went to war with other tribes to capture slaves. Well, from the point that they were captured to the trek back to the coast of West Africa, and then from West Africa to what was considered the New World, usually stopping off in the Caribbean first, and some of them would have stayed in the Caribbean, and then some of them would have gone on to North America. But that was like a kind of a 3-step process. So the capture was the first part. From the moment that they were captured, the men in particular were considered the most valuable because they would have been the strongest, and they would have been able to work the hardest at the time of capture. So, in order to prevent the men from being able to run away, they had this long piece of board, usually, or something, a chain or something, that was stuck between them and other men so that they would be connected and would not be able to run away. And there's a picture of this on slide 27 that shows this. But then the women and children that were also captured would be chained to them so they couldn't run away. But the men were considered the most valuable at that time because of the ability to work hard. Women were also valuable because they could have children, and their children could also be slaves. And then children were considered valuable if they were healthy, because if you capture like a young child, then you have their entire lifetime ahead of them to use them as slaves. So you really wanted to make sure that they didn't run away. So once they were captured, they were trekked to the coast of West Africa. And some of them were captured in the interior, so this could take weeks to months, this trek of walking from the place they were captured back to the coast of West Africa before getting on ships. Now, once they got to the coast, they were basically put into pens as if they were cattle. They would have been inspected, their teeth, their hair, their body. The men and women would have had their genitals inspected. The men to make sure, they were virile men and could have children. The women would be checked to make sure that they could have children. So they were treated as cattle. They were not treated as people. And then once that happened, the initial inspection, they were loaded on a small boat to be taken to the larger ship. Sometimes the slaves figured out what was happening at this point, and some of them jumped overboard off of the small boat in order to prevent themselves from being taken to the larger ship. Taken away from their homeland. After a while, there were preventative measures taken to make sure that wouldn't happen. So the ones who didn't jump overboard were then taken from the small boat onto the large boat. And then they would have had to endure harsh treatment for weeks to months before reaching their destination. Now, on these boats, initially, when the Atlantic slave trade starts off, they had allowed some of the slaves to be topside to get the fresh air and so on and so forth. But after a while, the slaves started to jump overboard again because they'd rather death than a life of servitude or slavery. So after that, the slave ships started to be outfitted like cargo ships, and where they started to pack the slaves in pretty much as just like sardines, as many slaves as possible. Some, like on the picture that's on slide, let's see, 29, although they would have not been topside. It just shows you kind of what their area would have looked like. They would have just had enough room to sit. Other ships were had portions that could only be about probably this wide, where they had to slide in and they would lay flat the entire voyage until they reached their destination. Now, they would be in that spot the entire trip. They would often pee on themselves, poop on themselves, and often the smell would get so bad they would vomit on themselves, but they had to stay in that location the entire time. And because of that, oftentimes disease spread very quickly. So if a slave was considered to be sick, then the slave trader would take that slave and throw that person overboard so that the rest of the slaves wouldn't get sick. But most of the time, they stayed in one location. Some of them tried not to eat. They started to starve themselves because they wished for death. But then they would have been force-fed just enough to survive the trip, though. Not all of them survived, but the ones that did were not going to have a happy life after that. Once they got to the first destination of the Caribbean, they were taken off the ship again, put into pens again. They were kind of cleaned up a little bit because that would have been a very harsh, dirty, disgusting voyage. And you want your cattle to look good for the sale. And remember, that's how they were being treated, as cattle. So they would clean up the slaves a little bit, and then once again, they're put up for inspection before the slave auctions, where their teeth would be inspected, their hair, the genitals, once again, all being like if they were a horse or something. You'd want your prize stallion to look good, so on and so forth. And that's how they would be sold to the highest bidder. And many of them would have stayed in the Caribbean, where they had only a life expectancy of about 5 years, because the life in the Caribbean was very harsh. They were worked to death, or the climate itself was very harsh, so they didn't often survive very much. But if they were sold to someone from North America to go to the North American slave markets, they would have lived longer, but their life wouldn't have been any better. Still, it would have been a lifetime of slavery. They just would have lived a little bit longer than they did in the Caribbean. So that voyage, though, from the coast of Africa to the slave markets in North America was considered the Middle Passage, and not everyone survived that trip. Um, it was very harsh. 1 in 4 slaves died along the way, and it could last weeks to months, just depended. Um, and it was just very demeaning. It was not anything like the Enlightenment, because they definitely were not treated as human or free, so they didn't have rights and things like that. But and then from there, slavery started to spread, especially in North America. In the Caribbean, still, they did not have a sustaining slave population in the Caribbean because of the harsh climate, the harsh treatment of the slaves. The birth rate was low, so they had to have a constant influx of slaves coming in. In North America, though, they treated their slaves a little bit better. They made sure to feed and clothe them, and they often had less working days, although it was still pretty harsh. But because of that, the birth rate was higher, and they had more of a sustaining slave population because the children survived and so on and so forth. But that just led to the use of more and more slaves, in particular up in the southern, what can be considered the southern colonies. Slavery really took off. The life under slavery was very harsh. You really couldn't, as a slave, have a normal, typical family life. They did try to create families with a husband, wife, and children. Didn't always work out very well because the husband didn't really have the rights to, control his family, to keep it together, because women and children could be, and even the male could also be sold at any given time, so the families would not be kept together. Oftentimes the slave owners would rape the female slaves in order just because, and then in order to have more slave children, even though it was their children, still they would do that, and it left both the woman feeling powerless, but also the man, the male slave, because he couldn't do anything about it, his wife being raped. So there were not typical family structures, although they did try to create them. In the northern colonies, most of the time the slaves lived in the households with the families, so they had less autonomy. In the southern colonies, because there was more land and everybody was spread out a little bit more, the plantation owners often created slave quarters so that the slaves lived separately. And because of that, they were able to create their own communities in a way. And that helped them a little bit more. They were able to kind of maintain their own culture in a way, because they had their own religious beliefs, they had their own ceremonies, rituals, things like that, that they could continue on their downtime when they weren't working. In the north, it wasn't, they weren't allowed to do that, so it was less of a community environment for slaves in northern colonies as to southern. Not all slaves were just willing to be captured and kept as slaves. There were some rebellions. One of them that was talked about in your book and in the PowerPoint is the Stono Rebellion. Happened in 1739, Stono, South Carolina. This was a little bit atypical of rebellions, though, because the slaves, these were new slaves that had just been brought in, but these slaves had been used as soldiers fighting for a war overseas, so they had training, and they had the soldier mentality. So they kind of decided they didn't want to be slaves anymore, so they marched into a firearm shop, killed the colonists there, stole the firearms, went off. They were going to try to get to Florida. So if you remember when I mentioned before, if they got to Florida, they would be free. But they were stopped before they got there. one reason was that they were going to these different plantations along the way and killing the masters there and trying to free the slaves on the way. So that kind of held them back a little bit. But the colonists, they put forward their own militia and stopped the rebellion. They killed 30 slaves, captured most of the rest, who were later killed to put down the rebellion completely. They even killed people who were not part of the rebellion, but just to send a message. But that led to harsher laws being passed about slaves. One of them, the Negro Act, that really put restrictions on slave life, forbade slaves from growing their own food, assembling groups, learning to read. Learning to read, could be a way of freedom. So any way that freedom could be seen, it was taken away. But also at this time, you get more and more the rise that race is involved in slavery. Because before this, you still had some indentured servants who worked. But now, since you're getting more and more slavery being the form of labor, you get the identification that dark skin equals slave. So you get race-based slavery really taking off. And that it started to be seen that these people who had darker skin and who were slaves were inherently inferior than those who were lighter skinned, and so on and so forth. So you get this racism, basically racial caste system that was created, and it still is around today. It hasn't disappeared. Other things that were happening in the colonies, for the most part, towards the end of the 1600s, the English government started to take a back step away from the colonies. The colonies were pretty much established by that point. They were doing well, but England was still fighting wars and doing other things, and they were having problems of their own. For instance, you'll read about the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Once again, religion playing a large part in what's going on in England, because James II takes over when Charles II dies. James II is a Catholic, and England still wants to be Protestant, so they ask instead for, excuse me, Mary, who is a Protestant and also James II's daughter. They want her husband, William of Orange, to come and take over the throne. So they pretty much ask them to do that. And it's called a Glorious Revolution, a bloodless revolution, because pretty much there was no bloodshed. James II just didn't have enough backing anyway, so he had to flee. Because William the Orange had a good army with him, so they took over. But for the most part, they had a board of trade to oversee what was going on in the colonies, but they really didn't put much laws into effect. They weren't that focused on the colonies. So the colonists started to get what's called salutary neglect, meaning England was pretty much still in charge, but the colonists were doing whatever they wanted to, basically. And they liked that, of course. So, it was a win-win for everybody. Until, once again, and this lasted about 70-ish years, that salutary neglect. So, it really had a foothold until war breaks out. War changes everything, of course. So, the war itself, the larger war, was called the 7 Years' War. And this war was really between most of the nations that existed at the time. France, England, Austria, Russia, Prussia. Prussia is what becomes Germany later. Spain, Native Americans got involved in North America. Even those in Southeast Asia were, having their part in it as well. It was pretty much a world war. We just don't call it a world war. But in North America, it's called the French and Indian War. Why was it called the French and Indian War? Because the English end up winning and they get to name the war, so they said it was because the pesky French and their native allies, so why not call it the French and Indian War? It was their fault. But anyway, it was a larger war, but in North America, that part of the war was the French and Indian War. And what it was is that pretty much France and England were the ones who were setting up colonies in North America. And so you get the English, who are pushing more and more westward, are starting to come more and more into contact with French settlements, because the French had already set up some, not many. They didn't have that many people living in North America, but they had some settlements there. They had some forts. But they started to come in contact with the French. So it starts to become kind of a race on who's going to dominate the area. And we're talking about the West. We're not talking about the West that we think of today. We're talking about around the Great Lakes area, which is still, for us, considered more of the northeast corner of the United States. But that was their western frontier at the time. So the French were already settled there. They started to put up more forts when they saw the English pushing westward. The largest was Fort Duquesne, which was in southwest Pennsylvania. So once again, still northeast, but for them that was the western portion. Virginian colonists, they started to put more forts. They decided to build one called Fort Necessity. Necessity to, have a fort to go against the French. And they sent, at the time, an inexperienced military colonel, George Washington, to fight against the French and prevent them from building more forts. And it was at that some skirmishes broke out, and George Washington lost soundly and had to surrender and eventually head back to the east. But these skirmishes led to more of the actual war that gets started. So over time, the fighting takes place. Eventually, England wins the entire war, the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War, and comes out on top. But before we get to that point, what happens? So, because of the war going on, the colonists start to decide they need to do something about it. So they form what's called the Albany Congress. 7 of the colonies sent reps to Albany, New York, to discuss, this war that's going on and what should be done about it. First, they wanted to convince the Iroquois to fight against the French. However, the Iroquois had made a pact with the French that they would not do that, so that didn't happen. Benjamin Franklin comes up with a plan he calls the Albany Plan. He says what we should do, we should place all the colonies under a president general that's supposed to be appointed by the crown, so the monarchy, the English monarchy, in order to manage the activity on the frontier, supply troops and things like that, but also handle negotiations with the natives that live there. It would also create a single legislature with representatives from each colony, dependent on the amount of taxes paid, though. So it wouldn't be equal representation. And it failed pretty much soundly. One, because, the colonies had been developing independently at this point. There was no unified colony or anything like that. It was just every colony doing its own thing, pretty much. And they were used to the salutary neglect, so they didn't want the English monarchy coming over and having power over them, so they were not willing to do that. So the results were, war officially breaks out. It's pretty harsh on both sides. The English don't do so well in the beginning. In fact, they're losing in the beginning. But then a new general takes over, Jeffrey Amherst. There's brutality on both sides. Native Americans get involved on both sides. But towards 1760, the English are winning, although it takes 3 more years, 1763, before that war officially ends. And that, in 1763, Spain, England, and France, they signed the Treaty of Paris. You're going to hear Treaty of Paris a lot because almost any time a war ends, there's going to be a Treaty of Paris because they gather in Paris and they sign a treaty. So it's called the Treaty of Paris. So keep that in mind. Anyway, so they create a proclamation line that kind of follows closely with the Appalachian Mountains. And England pretty much takes over North America. Canada also, and Florida too. Spain takes Louisiana from France. Mississippi River then is going to be kind of the boundary between the English and Spanish holdings. France is kind of kicked out of North America, so they lose a lot of prominence. But the main thing that comes out of the French and Indian War is this idea of revolution, because England had spent so much money on the entire war, the 7 Years' War portion, and also fighting in North America for the French and Indian War, that they wanted to recoup their losses in some way. And they came up with the bright idea that, hey, let's just tax the colonists and that'll give us some money back. And of course, the colonists didn't like that very much. So that leads to the idea of revolution. Because France lost the war, they're also more than willing to help the colonists when war does break out to fight against England. So that kind of leads to that French aid of the colonists. And then also there is a movement by the Native Americans. The Native Americans see that they are being used by different nations to fight against each other, and they always end up losing. So there's this movement called the Pan-Indian movement that they try to kind of do away with all that's involved with Europeans. And also the idea of race starts to come into play again. Just like with slavery, race starts to play an issue with the darker skin, that means slave. The natives started to see themselves as one race, which they hadn't before because they had identified mostly with their tribe. And now they started to see and said that maybe we're just one whole and we should come together and try to push out these people, these Europeans who were taking over our land and killing us. So one of the major leaders of this movement was Nealon. He was a Delaware prophet. Delaware was the name of the tribe, and that's also where we get the name of that state, Delaware. But he wanted to return to the old ways, the ways before Europeans became involved. He wanted natives to give up any material goods, alcohol, Christianity, go back to the old religions and languages and ways of dress. He traveled around teaching these movements called Pan-Indianism, and it was just completely anti-European, just to do away with everything they had introduced. Others got involved. One was Pontiac, the chief of the Ottawa. Nealon was more a pacifist in this. He was not really willing to fight against the Europeans. He just wanted to do away with their way of life. Pontiac, on the other hand, thought, let's just, kill as many of these colonists and get rid of them if we can. So, war breaks out. It's called Pontiac's Rebellion. There's brutality on both sides. The English, start to introduce smallpox blankets to Indian villages to kill them off. The natives start to poison the English drinking supply and water supply. And it's just, each side decides the only way forward is to get rid of the enemy for once and for all. But for the most part, the natives no longer had their French allies. They had already been decimated in population because of the diseases that had been introduced now over 200 years ago, the smallpox in particular. They did start to develop immunities by this point, but it was still pretty devastating to their populations. So they were quickly subdued and pushed westward across the Appalachian Mountains. So that was pretty much chapter 4. And wasn't it fun? But we'll learn more in chapter 5. You will notice that chapter 5 PowerPoint has 2 different PowerPoints for chapter 5, but there will only be one video. So stay tuned. See you soon.